Okay, so today I am absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Chris Wilson from the University of Oxford. And Chris is going to be talking to us all about the weird and wonderful world of Bdelloid Rotifers. So over to you, Chris.
Thanks so much. Can everyone hear me very
We can hear you loud and clear and we can see the
excellent?
slide.
Right, well, welcome everyone, and thanks to you all for coming. I'm delighted to be joining you from Oxford for this entoLIVE talk today. So I'm Dr. Chris Wilson. I'm a lecturer in biology at Oxford and a tutor in biology at St Hilda's College. Uh, when I was invited to give this talk, I have to say I was a little intimidated by the ento part of the series, because obviously ento usually refers to insects. And as you can probably see even from this title slide, the little funny named invertebrate animals that I work on here are definitely not insects. So sorry about that. But with that said, I hope I'm going to convince you today that my favorite animals, these Bdelloid Rotifers, at least have as much to tell us about interesting science as insects do, maybe more in some areas, especially on the topics of drugs, disease, and sex, which I hope you'll agree are all interesting and important words. So we'll get to the rotifers soon enough, but I want to start with what's obviously the most exciting part of the title here, which is insights about sex. So this next slide is called the problem of sex, and that might seem odd because I think, or I hope, that most of us don't find sex particularly problematic. And of course, by that I mean from a biological and a Darwinian perspective. Sex seems pretty simple. So girl rabbit meets boy rabbit. They have lots of baby rabbits, so many that they can't all possibly survive. The weaker ones then die or get eaten. The fittest rabbits pass on their genes. The population grows. It's basically how evolution works. It's all terribly Darwinian. It's about how many babies you can have. So anything that helps you have more babies in general will be favored. And sex certainly seems like an obvious and important thing to do by that score. However, in the 1960s and 70s, this gentleman had rather a lot to say about sex, and it wasn't all necessarily positive, despite being the 60s and 70s. So this is Professor John Maynard Smith of the University of Sussex, and he's one of the, or was one of the most distinguished mathematical theoreticians of evolution in the last century. And he thought that sex was a terribly difficult puzzle. In fact, he once called it the hardest problem in evolutionary biology, which is quite a statement coming from him. Let's think for a minute about why he might have said something like that. Well, Maynard Smith was thinking about the costs and the benefits of sex itself, particularly to female animals. And as we'll see when we think about the evolution of sex, it's really important to think from the perspective of females. And to him, it wasn't obvious that sex was such a good idea. Well, why not? Well, it turns out that sex has various disadvantages to females that make it actually start to seem really so unappealing that we have to wonder why it's even necessary, as illustrated here by some randomly selected recent tourists to the United Kingdom. That's just a joke, of course, assuming we're still allowed to make those. But joking aside, there is in fact some hard science behind this playful statement. And to illustrate the hard science, I would just invite you to imagine that each of you is a female fruit fly for a minute. I don't know, maybe that's preferable. Uh, anyway, yes, you're a female fruit fly. I thought I'd find a way to get insects in here somewhere to hold up the ento part of the talk. So this is you, and this graph is going to represent your life. So each of you audience members is one line on this little colorful chart, and it shows your life as a female fruit fly for about 60 days. If your life is in red, you're laying lots of eggs. If we're into the yellow section, you're not laying eggs anymore, but you're still alive. And when we hit the white section of your lifespan, you're dead. That's about it for the life of a female fruit fly. So quite a bit of red and yellow, red and orange, then some yellow, and then eventually you hit white. And that's 30 days or so is pretty good as fruit fly life goes. But this is for female fruit flies who had relatively little sex. They were exposed to few males, like 1 or 2 males in the first couple of days, and then they were left to get on with their own lives. If we look down here at a different group of female fruit flies that were exposed to lots of males and lots of sex, you might notice their lifespan looks distinctly different. So lots more red and orange here, but much less yellow, and the white part comes a lot sooner. Take a minute to appreciate the difference in your life as a female fruit fly between this situation and this situation. So on average, the flies in the lots of sex and males group had their lives cut nearly in half by all that exposure to males and sex. And this illustrates some of the costs of sex, which include things like fending off males, physical trauma, having to pump out all those eggs really early on, as well as harmful chemicals and possibly potential diseases transmitted in the seminal fluid itself. And it's not even as if she gets more babies out of it and wins in terms of evolution. Because if we look at her total lifetime reproductive output on average, it's a little lower, if anything, in the group exposed to lots of males. So even in evolutionary terms, the sex doesn't seem like a great idea here. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, maybe half of you are certainly thinking, that's all really relatable, but really, what alternative does she have as a female fruit fly? Isn't that just how the biological world typically works? It's a man's world or something. But the answer is no, it doesn't have to be that way. So this is a different species of fruit fly. That was Drosophila melanogaster. This is Drosophila mercatorum. And this species doesn't need males to have babies. So the females can lay eggs that aren't fertilized and hatch into more females without needing sperm, which is called asexual reproduction, or sometimes a virgin birth. It's not only possible, it's surprisingly common in nature among plants and animals. So we sometimes see it among water fleas and aphids, which can sometimes reproduce with sex and sometimes asexually. Dandelions often are asexual, but they can do a bit of both. There are some animals that only ever use asexual reproduction and basically clone themselves. Things like this lizard, or some stick insects. Sea monkeys are a popular example, sticking to our invertebrate theme. And bananas are propagated by cloning to keep them tasty and plentiful. On the other hand, there are a few larger animals that most of the time have sex, but just sometimes slip into asexual reproduction. We probably all read stories on the BBC website and other places of some shark that was left in its tank with no males and suddenly miraculously produced babies, again through this process of virgin birth, but mostly those things are sexual. The only things that never seem to reproduce asexually are mammals, which always use sex for various complicated reasons, including humans, where, again, sex is always needed, no virgin birth, at least not outside of the Bible context, where there might be a potential exception. And it turns out that asexuality is a really great alternative to sex from an evolutionary perspective, as well as a biblical perspective. And we can illustrate that with a bit of a tongue-in-cheek experiment if we compare populations with sexual and asexual reproduction. So here we have our asexual strategy, and here over here our sexual strategy. We have to slightly overlook the fact that Jesus should have been female because Mary was female, and female offspring are produced by females cloning themselves, but let's ignore that. There's lots of things to overlook in biblical stories. Anyway, we'll set up our comparison in our experiment. We'll give both asexual and sexual populations 4 individuals to start with, 4 over here and 4 over here. And every generation, we're going to have 3 offspring per individual. So over here on the asexual side, everyone has 3 babies. Of course, these are all female clonal offspring. And on the sexual side, 3 babies for everyone. We'll forget about inbreeding and also where Adam and Eve 2 came from. This is biology, not theology. The main message I want to get across is that because over here everyone has a sexual father and a mother, you're only getting half as many offspring per generation, even though everyone's having 3 offspring. Whereas over here, everyone's independently reproductive and everyone's female, so you're tripling your numbers every time. It's like the sexuals are paying a 50% tax because half of them are males. And males aren't capable of actually producing more offspring by themselves. All they're doing is fertilizing eggs that were there anyway. Eggs that, if the female had chosen to be asexual, she would have gone on to develop all by herself. We can continue our simulation with more offspring. And you can see that although both populations are growing, the asexuals are growing twice as quickly as the sexuals over here. And if we sort of plot that in the longest term, with the growth of the sexual and the asexual populations, there's a massive advantage in evolutionary terms to being asexual. You grow at twice the rate, and look, this is a logarithmic scale here, so they're really completely outcompeting the sexual version. So that you'd expect the sexuals to ascend to complete dominance in this ecosystem, while the sexuals paying this 50% tax are driven out of the evolutionary garden. So now we really start to see why sex is such a bad idea. And it gets worse. So sex has loads of costs. There's this cost of making males, these useless things that only fertilize eggs that were there anyway. There's the cost we experienced when we were female fruit flies, of having to find a mate and then all the trauma associated with mating, STDs, risks, and so on. There's another cost, yet another cost, which is this. If you have a successful set of genes so that you've reached the age of being ready to reproduce, of maturity, you might think evolution has worked, that set of genes must be doing something right. Wouldn't it be a good idea to pass on that successful set of genes to the next generation so that they can have the same adaptive traits as well? And yet, what happens is when we get to the age of reproduction, we don't conserve that combination of genes. Instead, we mix them up into new combinations that haven't been tested before. So you can have sets of genes that work really well together, that seem to all fit together and produce a useful working offspring. Maybe we can imagine these 2 cats, each of which looks fairly cat-like and is doing a good job of being a cat. But what do we do when we have sex? We chop and change these genes, and we can end up with something maybe more like this, that doesn't have genes that work well together, because it just hasn't been tested before. This is, again, slightly facetious, but you get the general idea. Why are we mixing genes up that work quite well? And yet, despite all these costs, as we all know, sex is everywhere. Nearly all plants and animals are sexual, fungi as well. And although we do have this small number of species that can reproduce without sex, if we plot where those asexual species fall on the tree of life, and they're here shown in blue with the sexual species in red, we find that the asexual groups are scattered and they're quite rare in the tree of life, and they're only at the very tips. So you might have a species here and there, maybe a whole genus there, but what you don't have is a really big diverse group of completely asexual organisms, which suggests, this pattern suggests, that asexuality can evolve, but it doesn't last very long. Something really bad happens to these organisms when they stop having sex. Despite all these costs, sex is really necessary. And the puzzle or the problem of sex is why asexuality is so bad when it seems like a smart thing to do. And that's what Maynard Smith meant when he talked about sex being the hardest problem in evolution. Given the massive advantages of being asexual, why put up with all these annoyances of sex? And we don't know the answer, I'll admit that right up front, despite 50 years of biologists coming up with weird and wonderful theories. We have some general ideas that I don't have time to get into in detail. I'll give you a sort of flavor of some general lines of thinking. Over 50 different hypotheses are out there. One idea is that sex helps to fix bad mutations that can happen in our DNA. So even if your father's copy has some mutation in it, you'll get a second copy from your mother that can kind of complement that so that you have at least one working copy of the gene. So sex might be good for helping keep bad mutations in control. A second idea is that if you have a good mutation that arises in one person, it's easier to spread it into lots of different genomes and genetic backgrounds if you can have sex, because then you can keep that good mutation going and it will feed through the whole population. Whereas if a good mutation happens in an asexual background and it just doesn't happen to reproduce, then it's lost forever. You can't shift it into other combinations of genes. And lastly, the idea we'll be spending most of our time with today is the idea that sex is just constantly mixing up genes in all kinds of ways. And the big advantage that gives is that it helps us to resist diseases, which are also always evolving and always changing. Why diseases in particular are a special case for needing sex, we will talk about in the next few slides. But we don't really have a clear answer among these three different ideas yet. I'm going to focus a little bit more today on this idea about diseases and shuffling genes to stay ahead of diseases. So the logic of that idea is basically that everything has parasites and pathogens and viruses and things out to exploit you, eat you, or infect you. And those organisms, like bacteria, evolve very quickly, and they get very good at infecting whatever the most common host genotype is at any given moment. And they're good at that because that's their most common food source. So they evolve quickly to exploit whatever combination of genes is out there in their hosts. But what sex does, as we've already hinted at, is it mixes up the genes that are there. It chops and changes them into new combinations. And those new combinations maybe haven't been seen before by the parasites. And so they're not so good at infecting them. And that's great for the hosts because they can avoid being exploited and infected. However, in turn, because those parasites and pathogens evolve quickly, they will quickly readapt to the next set of genes, and so the cycle kind of continues. Asexual organisms in this model are not ideal because they can't break up genes that have become vulnerable to disease. So once a disease evolves to be able to infect one of those individuals, it can infect all of them because they all have the same genotype. So in this model, the advantage of sex is that it shuffles and mixes up genes to let you keep up with diseases, which are just everywhere in everything. The name for this hypothesis is rather colorful. It's called the Red Queen hypothesis. And some of you literary fans might be nodding your heads at this point, but for those of you who don't get that reference, it's from Lewis Carroll's Alice Through the Looking Glass. And Alice, this is separate from Alice in Wonderland. This time she's gone through the mirror instead of down a rabbit hole, as you do. Anyway, she encounters this character called the Red Queen, who's a chess piece. This isn't the same as the Queen of Hearts, off with her head, different character. And she has to run to have a conversation with the Red Queen because the Red Queen is running very quickly. And they chat about various things. And after a while, Alice is tired and stops running. And then she notices that the Queen and she are standing next to the same tree that they were when they started. They haven't gone anywhere. And she asks the Queen, what's going on? That seems peculiar. In our country, you generally get to somewhere else if you ran very fast for a long time, as we've been doing. And the Queen says, well, that's a slow sort of country. Here, you see, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. So this metaphor has been used in evolution for this idea that hosts and parasites and diseases are both evolving as fast as they can, but not really getting anywhere relative to the other one, because both are constantly changing just to stay in the same place. And we can illustrate this idea of a never-ending race with disease with a famous example maybe from agriculture, and that is bananas. So these bananas that you see on the screen might look a little bit different from the kind of bananas that we're used to, which look like this, and there's a story behind that. These bananas are a variety called Gros Michel, or Big Mike, and in the early part of the last century, so about 100 years ago, they were the only commercial bananas available. There were vast swathes of Central and South America devoted to nothing but growing these Gros Michel bananas. They were so economically important that they're where the term banana republic comes from. Such was the importance of this cultivar. But then, about 100 years ago, something devastating happened to the Big Mike banana. A disease popped up called Panama disease that was just devastating and was destroying acres of these plantations. And the New York Times was very concerned about it. It ran this, what seems today like a very clickbaity headline: "Banana disease ruins plantation. Fruit blight costs millions. No remedy available." It reminds me of some of the more modern headlines that we see. It's nothing is new under the sun. Anyway, this banana panic turned out to be a real thing. The bananas were devastated. It was caused by a fungus called Panama. Well, the fungus was Fusarium, but the disease was called Panama disease, something called tropical race 1, and it just spread like wildfire. And the reason it spread so well is because the Big Mike banana was completely asexual. So there was no pollination, there was no mixing of genes, they were just clonally propagated. So they all had the same genes. And when the disease popped up, it could wipe out all of these giant plantations across the world. Luckily, there was a solution. Another variety of banana was available that resisted the disease. It had slightly different genes, and it was called Cavendish. It was also an asexual variety, but it was resistant to Panama disease tropical race 1. And so the future of the banana was secured forever, and that was the end of the story. Except, obviously, that wasn't the case, because 100 years later, up pops another version of the Panama disease, this time tropical race 4, because it's evolved, and now we're in the same position again, where the New York Times is screaming about the possibility all bananas will be going extinct. And that's a real concern because, again, these are asexual. All bananas are the same. And if we don't get some variety back in there, they really are at risk. If they had sex, maybe they'd be able to keep up with this iteration of our Red Queen process. So drawing on that as our example, we can kind of make some predictions about the Red Queen hypothesis. If this is right, then groups that have been asexual for a long time should have real problems with diseases and resisting them. Or maybe they should have unusual other ways of changing their genes to keep up with never-ending onslaughts of disease. And that's finally where our rotifers come in, and where the story gets a little bit more focused on the animals rather than the ideas. So the microscope was invented, 300, 400 or so years ago, and then popularized by people like Robert Hooke here, who used it to look at things like cork and other plants and came up with the term cells. There's a new world being discovered at the time. People were so interested in all the observations that were being made through microscopes. And particularly this gentleman, Antony van Leeuwenhoek, who was a Dutch textile merchant, actually, but he used microscopes in his work for doing things like looking at the thread count in fine fabrics. But he didn't only apply his microscopy to fabrics. He also looked at biological materials. And in doing so, he was among the first, well, he was the first, to see things like bacteria, single-celled organisms, and, importantly, microscopic animals. So this is one of his microscopes. It's got a very finely ground lens here, and then a needle on which you place material, and then look at it through the lens in good sunlight. And he also had very good eyesight, too. One day, he put some pondweed onto his needle, looked at it through the microscope, and he saw things that looked like these funny little wormy things with what looked like crowns or wheels stuck on their heads. And he called these wheel animalcules, which is rather quaint. And today we call these rotifers, which basically means wheel carriers. The kinds of rotifers that Leeuwenhoek first saw are these ones called bdelloid rotifers. The B is silent, so it's just bdelloid. It means leech-like because they are soft-bodied and move around a little bit like a caterpillar or a leech, with little suckers on both ends of their bodies. They're about 0.5 millimeter long. Those aren't really wheels on their heads. They are a field of cilia hair cells that beat in a rhythmical pattern like this to pull in pieces of food which then get chewed up here in the jaws. Oh, it just disturbed it and it contracted. And then the food gets digested and turned into energy, which they use to produce eggs, which they lay out of the other end. Bdelloid rotifers are really common. They can be found in every freshwater habitat worldwide, even if it's very temporary or harsh. So you can find them in deserts, even if it rains just once or twice a year. You can find them on the edges of glaciers where it might be frozen most of the year, but sometimes melts. But they really like it in puddles, ponds, mosses, soils, lichens. They really don't mind being desiccated. You can freeze them. They're really tolerant of radiation. So I think many people have probably heard of tardigrades that are famous for their incredible resilience, and they're the most, got one back here actually, they're the most resilient animals ever, and they'll survive nuclear war and so on. Well, rotifers are even more, or bdelloid rotifers are even more radiation tolerant than tardigrades, like 5 times more tolerant. It's just that nobody's heard of bdelloid rotifers because they're not so cute with the little legs and the faces and the water bears and moss piglets. So yeah, I love tardigrades too, but they get too much publicity. Back to our rotifers. The other thing they can tolerate is even toxic conditions. So we found DNA from rotifers even in this chemical waste dump here. So again, when you want to talk animal survivors, think bdelloid rotifers as well as tardigrades. Here's another picture, a video of rotifers. This is to show you the scale. So this is rotifers moving around next to a human hair. It's actually one of my hairs. These are the animals. These are the eggs that they've laid here and here. About 0.5 millimeter long. We've seen thousands of these things in the 300 years since van Leeuwenhoek first spotted them. They're very diverse. We've described hundreds of species, multiple genera and families of bdelloid rotifers have been described and drawn in very fine detail. But there's something very peculiar about bdelloid rotifers relative to not just other invertebrates, but relative to all other animals. And that is that every single individual we've seen is female. There doesn't appear to be any evidence of males and no sex. They reproduce by laying eggs that hatch into little copies of their mother, little clonal eggs. So it's just like our asexual experiment from earlier. You have one rotifer, she lays eggs which hatch into little copies, and then copies of copies and so on. It's a perfectly asexual system driven by virgin birth. And they're the largest animal group by far in which there's no known males and they're all apparently asexual. And that makes them really interesting, not just because they're resilient and kind of cute looking, but interesting for our evolutionary problem from the start. So maybe they're an exception to this general rule that asexuals don't last long. Remember I told you about a few lizards, sea monkeys, bananas, and so on. Those are the things that we find here at the tips of family trees that might be popping up here and there, but not surviving for some reason. Well, here we have a group of asexuals where all of the species, all the genera, all the families are obligately asexual, no males. And that seems to indicate that they've lasted without sex for millions of years, because it takes millions of years to diversify into that many species. So do we have here an exception to the rule about sex? And what can that tell us about why sex exists in the first place? Seems interesting is what I thought when I first heard about these things, and that's why I first started doing further investigation of what's going on with these weird little animals. Maynard Smith was upset by them as well, our friend from earlier in the talk. He called them something of an evolutionary scandal because they didn't seem to fit any of the theories people were coming up with. How can you survive this long without sex? You're supposed to have gone extinct, and yet they haven't. Coming back to our theoretical work, remember we left the Red Queen hypothesis with this prediction. If you're a group that's been without sex for a very long time, you ought to have trouble resisting diseases. Or You need unusual other ways to change your genes to keep up with the whole red queen disease problem. So what about the rotifers? Do they have any diseases, or did they just get really lucky when God was handing out all the pathogens and they didn't happen to get any assigned to them? Well, that doesn't seem very likely, and in fact, it's not the case. They have loads of diseases, particularly fungal diseases. So these rotifers have all been infected by deadly fungi. They've basically been turned into little, they ate the wrong kind of fungal spore, and it turned into an infection that's exploded out of them. This is the dead rotifer, and here's the fungus growing up out of them, producing more spores. Or in this case, the fungus is still inside them, but it's turned them into a living zombie where they walk around releasing fungal spores and they don't reproduce by themselves anymore. So there are lots of nasty fungal diseases that bdelloid rotifers can suffer from. They're quite popular in the fungal disease community, possibly because they're asexual, so they don't have, they're a bit of a sitting duck maybe from an evolutionary perspective. So if we plot the fungal family tree here, all the groups in red have jumped into attacking bdelloid rotifers in different ways. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different groups of fungi that have all independently decided that bdelloid rotifers look tasty and vulnerable and have decided to specialize on them. This group of fungal diseases here is really quite diverse. This is a group called Rotiferoptera, means rotifer eaters, and they've been evolving with the rotifers for, we think, about 50 million years. So it's not a new thing. Apparently, rotifers have always had to put up with and deal with these diseases. So how are they managing to do that without sex? Why haven't they ended up like our dead Big Mike bananas, wiped out by a disease that figures out how to infect their genotypes? They have lots of diseases. Do they have now maybe some unusual way of dealing with those diseases? And the phrase I often use when describing this part is maybe they have some weird trick that lets them deal with diseases in ways other animals can't. But to me, I don't know, weird trick always makes me think of like pop-up ads and are your asexual rotifers getting sick? Doctors hate this weird trick. So if I use the phrase weird trick too much, just bear with me. What I mean, more properly speaking, is are there any particular adaptations or ecological features that bdelloid rotifers have that might reduce the problem of disease that lets them live for so long without sex? And there's at least one we can talk about sort of straight away. I mentioned earlier that they're really good at surviving desiccation that lets them live even in dry moss. So when the water disappears from their patch of the moss on a tree and it dries out, the rotifers contract into a little ball and enter a state of suspended animation in which they can survive months or even years until water returns and they pop right back to life and carry on reproducing. And in that desiccated state, they're basically like a dry particle of dust, and they can blow around on the wind in that state and colonize new patches of moss or new puddles and start new populations. Why does this matter? Well, it turns out that those fungal diseases don't like being dried out. I mean, they're fungus. We all know that bathrooms are a great place for mold because they like it. Mold likes it when it's damp. But if you're an animal that dries out completely every so often in its life cycle and then blows around, that's going to be a hostile environment for the fungus. And it turns out it can't survive desiccation and it can't travel with the rotifers when they blow around on the wind. And so infections are common in some of these wetter patches, but the rotifers can escape by drying up and blowing away to different patches. And that forms a weird trick, if you like, for escaping from fungal diseases. You dry up and blow away and then play hide and seek in the landscape so that when you move, you're encountering new fungus that hasn't seen you before. It's a bit like mixing up not mixing up your genes through sex, but mixing up where you are physically in space and time and kind of outrunning, if you like, the diseases in physical space instead of having sex. So that's a nice little ecological trick that might help explain why these rotifers, thanks to their lifestyle, are good at persisting despite diseases and without sex. You might call it dry and seek, so the diseases are not co-evolving with the same rotifers for a long period of time. That's a great way of moving animals around, but I've already been telling you that sex is about shuffling and moving genes around. Do they have any weird tricks for doing that sort of thing as well? How do genes get shuffled? I've already talked about sex as a way of shuffling genes, and that's kind of so obvious we sometimes forget that that's what sex is doing. It's shuffling genes, crossing over chromosomes, mixing them into new combinations. It's the basis of everything I've told you about shuffling genes to keep up with diseases. You're bringing in new combinations that are resisting the current diseases. It's how our old friend the Red Queen actually works. We sort of implicitly know that's how it works as well, because when we think about crops, we know that crop monocultures, where you have the same plant planted over massive areas, are vulnerable to diseases. And it's precisely because there's not genetic diversity in those monocultures. To fix those problems, what do? We bring in new genes, we breed the crops differently, and we introduce resistance. But that's through sex. We take a susceptible, tasty crop, and we might back cross it with some resistant genes from some wild relative, wild potato or wild corn or whatever. And then through lots and lots of sex, we mix the genes together until we get one that has both tasty product and it's resistant to diseases. But that's not the only way of mixing up genes. Other organisms that are less familiar to us have other ways of mixing genes. Bacteria, for instance, don't have sex. They move genes around through something called horizontal gene transfer. Rather than moving genes and shuffling them from parent to offspring, they move genes horizontally through various weird and wonderful mechanisms. But basically, it's picking up bits of DNA and writing it into their own genomes through various mechanisms. And this movement of DNA among bacteria by copying, stealing, and writing it into their own genomes is actually useful to know about because it's relevant to how bacteria resist our antibiotics. So there's potentially a clinical and medical application here. Antibiotics are basically chemicals that are made by some organisms to kill bacteria. Sometimes they're made by bacteria, sometimes they're made by fungi. And we put them into pill form and we borrow them and we use them to treat our own diseases. Famously, Fleming discovered penicillin on a plate where a fungus was making a chemical that wiped out the bacteria around it. The chemicals themselves are various complicated things that look something like this. The problem is when you give pills to treat bacterial infections, some of those bacteria will resist the antibiotic. They'll survive it because their genes are slightly different in a way that makes them resistant to that chemical. And the more we use the pills, the more resistant the bacteria become thanks to evolution. And the nice trick that bacteria have, or the unhelpful trick they have, is that once one becomes resistant, they can pass that resistance to other bacteria through horizontal gene transfer. That's how the spread of antibiotic resistance happens so quickly. Genes are moving, DNA is being copied from one bacterium to another. And that's becoming a real problem. Like millions of people are dying each year from antibiotic-resistant diseases. So it's really important to help preserve and develop new antibiotics. Yeah, interestingly, the genes that actually make antibiotics themselves also can move around horizontally in bacteria. So it's a whole ecosystem where the chemicals that kill bacteria and the defensive chemicals are both moving around horizontally. Why is this relevant? Well, because it turns out that bdelloids have another weird trick, which is that they too, like bacteria, are stealing and moving genes around by horizontal transfer. So when we started sequencing their genomes, looking at what was in their DNA, at first, most of the DNA looked pretty normal. About 90% of bdelloid rotifer DNA looks like what we call normal animal genes. But there was this other 10% that at first we thought might be some kind of mistake. 1 in 10 of the genes in bdelloid rotifers didn't look like animal DNA at all, but seemed to have arrived in their genomes through horizontal transfer. You might call these stolen or alien genes. they looked much more like genes we'd expect to see in bacteria or fungi or even plants. They looked so out of place. It's hard to describe. If you're looking at genomic DNA from an animal, how weird and out of place it looks to see a bunch of plant DNA in there. And yet there are thousands of genes that have been copied into rotifer genomes from things like plants. Just completely bizarre. It's like petting your cat and then you get to the tail and realize that the fur is basically turned into grass or something. This is unprecedented. There are no other animals that have anything like this level of random alien stolen DNA in their genomes. So this certainly seems like another very weird trick going on. Could this acquisition of strange DNA be another way that helps bdelloids keep up with diseases? We investigated that by looking at whether the rotifers could ever resist some of these fungal diseases, maybe instead of just running away from them. And we found at least one species that was really good at resisting the fungus. So there are two different rotifer species. We put them in tubes and we dumped on a load of pathogenic fungal spores to see if they would die. And it turned out that this species did indeed die quite a lot. This is how many died after 72 hours. Like 80% of these were all killed, but this species seemed to be resistant. Only a 20% or even less were succumbing to the disease. That was interesting, we thought. Why are these ones resisting? What genes might they be using to resist this disease that this one doesn't have? We focused on this species and we looked at the genes inside its genome, and we found something very surprising. The genes that that species had been stealing from bacteria were the same genes that they used to make antibiotics. They were these things called biosynthetic gene clusters. These are really enormous enzymes that act like little molecular factories or production lines where they use different bits of biochemical machinery to stick together complicated molecules. You can think of them as like in the genome, it's a giant chemical factory that produces one particular chemical. And the chemicals they produce are things like antibiotics and antimicrobial chemicals. These genes, these biosynthetic gene clusters, are really common in bacteria and fungi. It's where most of our antibiotics originally came from. But they're vanishingly rare in animals. Animals don't do this kind of biochemical heavy lifting because they just don't have the genes. Except, apparently, that bdelloid rotifers do. So they have stolen dozens of these cellular chemical factories from bacteria. They've copied the bacterial DNA into their own genomes, and they now encode dozens of these complicated molecular factories. And when the fungus attacks, they produce these chemicals themselves. These are chemicals that match well-known antibiotics that are normally produced by bacteria and fungi. And they produce chemicals that are predicted to have antimicrobial effects. And when the fungi attack, we looked at whether these genes are turned on. And it turns out that all of these blue ones were increased in output by 16 times, so very strongly, when the fungus was introduced. This resistant species here had 10 times stronger expression of these chemical factory genes as the susceptible species, which makes us think that this resistance that it showed is something to do with stealing genes for producing antimicrobial chemicals. The genes themselves, we can use computers to predict what sorts of chemicals they make. It's a slightly complicated process, which I'll simplify here a little bit. But we think these chemicals that are being produced are unknown new chemicals with some similarity to what we know of as antimicrobial chemicals, things like antibiotics, things that have antifungal activity, for instance. So this is the gene, this is the chemical, but it's not one we're familiar with. It's one we think might be new to science. Some of them look like other well-known chemicals that, for instance, inhibit the growth of fungi or even human and plant pathogens. So we don't really know what chemicals they produce, but based on predictions, we think they're sort of antimicrobial looking chemicals being produced by stolen genes. Just to simplify the whole thing, we know that microbes use DNA to produce chemicals to fight and inhibit each other. We think rotifers might be picking up some of these genes through horizontal transfer and then using them to protect themselves from their own diseases. And we've written about maybe how some of these chemicals might have use for humans in protecting our own, well, patients and maybe crops from diseases in turn. So maybe this is another weird trick, stealing genes that can produce antibiotics, basically, that can help rotifers resist diseases, even though they're asexual. It might be because they're asexual that they need to be able to do this. So just to summarize, and leave us at least a couple of minutes for questions, these bdelloid rotifers, in addition to being cool animals, are the biggest group that's known without males or sex. They also happen to have two weird tricks that help them specifically deal with diseases. They can escape from fungal diseases by drying up and blowing away. And apparently, they can steal recipes for antibiotics or other antimicrobial chemicals from bacteria, which they then turn on to resist their own fungal diseases. So these special, strange things about the only large asexual group maybe give clues that sex might indeed exist to help with fighting diseases. And excitingly, in the future, maybe these rotifers can show us new ways of helping deal with our own disease problems, fighting crop pathogens and other fungal problems maybe, or antibiotic resistance, by sharing what they've stolen from bacteria over millions of years. I want to thank, at the end of this talk, all the colleagues and funders who've been part of helping investigate this story, and also the organizers for inviting me to speak today. There are some links to more information about this story in the chat, and I'd be happy to take at least a couple of questions. Thank you.